Welcome to Polaris-Live, conversations on the U.S China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. This week's United States presidential elections were labeled the most important signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in generations. Throughout this autumn, a select group of international experts have been invited to offer their views on the election's results and how countries around the world, especially China, are preparing for their outcome. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, and my guest today is Dr. Janka Oertel. Dr. Oertel is director of the Asia program and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She previously worked as a senior fellow in the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund, holds a PhD from the University of Jena, has published widely on topics related to the Asia-Pacific region. She joins us today from Berlin. Welcome to Polaris Live, Dr. Oertel.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Listen, I was going to start with these monumental elections in America, but, I read in the paper today that the Chancellor of Germany has pretty much disbanded its government. And I just wonder, can you give us an update on that? Because all of this comes at this crucial time when America is going through its change. So let's just start with that.
Yeah, these were quite monumental 24 hours in the life of a German analyst that works on the U.S. and China. We're all prepared for a conversation about, we would spend weeks and weeks and months and working on scenarios and what's the outcome of the election. We've been closely watching that. And just as we have the result, the government crisis in Germany begins, which is a kind of a research double whammy that is then really hard to tackle at a certain point.
Yes.
The situation that we have at the moment is that the government coalition has fallen apart because of unavoidable differences between the different parties. The government was holding together by a thread only anyway. So there are some voices that are saying, well, this is a good thing. This allows kind of Germany a fresh start. The problem is that it's going to be a fresh start with a slight delay because we're still sort of asking when will be those next elections. The current plan of the Chancellor is to have elections in March next year, which means we will have no kind of fully functioning government with a parliamentary majority once the Trump administration is inaugurated in January.
Yes.
And given the speed with which the Trump administration has, or Trump himself has said he will want to act on certain issues, this could be a bit of a problem because it would leave a Germany-sized hole, not only in the middle of Europe, but also within the G7 and also within sort of global politics. Whether we can afford that at this point in time, I think is a really important question.
And whether the European Union can, seeing that Germany is pretty much the engine that they rely on. But, I'll tangent now to where I'd wanted to start earlier before the German news came in, that this is the first Polaris Live program after the U.S. presidential election 2 days ago. I know it's still early, but how are the results playing out in Germany, given the issues that we just talked about in Germany itself? But how are the issues playing out in Germany and in the wider European Union? Can you give us some sense?
Yes, obviously, this is not a surprise to the Europeans as a result. There was a lot of planning that went into what is coming out in the US election. But I think it is fair to say that in large parts of Europe, it's kind of a disappointment. There was a hope for a different kind of version of an election outcome. But I do think because people have been prepared for this, that there's not going to be this long phase of regret and worry. But this is more about what is the best move, the best next move for each player. The biggest concern that we could have now for all those that are minded towards sort of a more unified European approach, towards a sort of Brussels-centric approach at the moment, is that each of the member states starts freelancing. starts taking their own position vis-a-vis the US, starts bilateral deals, bilateral offers being made, and thereby weakens the overall position of the European Union, and makes it harder then to come up with an actual game plan. And I think this is also, there's a lot of this is connected to specific trade-related questions and China-related questions. A lot of the Eastern European states obviously would like to be in the good books of the Trump administration to make sure that security commitments are not being withdrawn. Given that we have a full-scale war at the EU's borders, basically, there is huge concern in Central and Eastern Europe about sort of future security commitments of the US. And then if you are in sort of in other parts of Europe, Germany is a part of that, and Spain, also France, the question of how Trump administration policies vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the kind of the trade,
Yes.
vis-a-vis trade in general, will have an effect on future European prosperity.
Yes. Really interesting, your take on that. Well, the European Union, has been one of the seminal developments of the 20th century. Really unimaginably wonderful development in many people's eyes. Do you think that's still the way Europeans look at the EU?
Well, I mean, most of the time it's usually the scapegoat for something, it's blamed for something, it's doing something wrong. But from a meta perspective, I guess a lot of Europeans that are kind of in the sensible center of the political spectrum,
Yes.
it's the only thing that's keeping us sane at the moment, the fact that we're not alone in a world of might makes right, and in a world of great power competition, where just by being 27 and just by being one of the largest economies, just by being one of the most important trade blocs as a whole, we do play a role, we do feature at all. And I do think that you see a lot of agency that is actually moved to Brussels. It's in part due to the fact that Berlin and Paris are at the moment domestically quite weak.
Yes.
Can't really bring all of their weight to the table. But what you've seen in the latest decision on tariffs when it comes to electric vehicles from China has been one of the first sort of staring contests between Berlin and Brussels, where you've actually seen Brussels holding its ground and providing some sort of united front vis-a-vis China, but also basically sending signals towards the United States and saying, well, if you need a phone number for Europe, that proverbial one that we've always been looking for, call von der Leyen, she'll answer. And I think that's been sort of the approach through the Biden administration, and there is great hope in Brussels that this can be carried on, and that the Trump administration can see the potential that Brussels has in actually being a good partner for some of the things that matter to the Trump administration.
Yes.
And actually help build also strength in numbers and a new framework for prosperity in the 21st century.
Yes, I'm often reminded of Dr. Kissinger's famous question, I think that you alluded to, right? If I want to call Europe, what number do I dial? Well, there is a number that one can dial. But listen, one of the issues that always comes up when Americans talk about Mr. Trump, who will be the next president of the United States, and especially in the security community in which you and also I play a small part. If the worst were to happen and the U.S. dramatically reduces its commitment to NATO, do you think the Europeans can assume the military alliance's leadership? America always part of it, hopefully never leaves it, but Europeans assume the military alliance leadership, use the opportunity to create a potent military force?
The question is not whether they can, the question is whether they will. I think this has not been a question of potential, and I do think that the Trump administration in its first term had put the finger on the right spot there. The fact that Europeans hadn't been spending as much on their own defense, had not been worried that much about their own defense, where it was a kind of a reasonable question to say, why should the US care more about Europe's security than Europe does? Why should the US care more about Europe's cybersecurity than Europe does? Being reminded of the whole 5G debate we had during the first Trump administration. I think this is a reasonable question and a reasonable request, something that has been acknowledged in many parts of Europe, in vast circles, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But if you want, and I have to maybe apologize because I had probably the worst 24 hours of my professional career behind me just now. So allow me a little cynicism here.
Of course.
But, I do think that the political will needed to really sort of grab ourselves by the hair and drag ourselves out of the mess that we've created is currently not there. And whether the Trump administration can provide sort of the galvanizing potential that is needed to bring together the political will in Europe to actually do the things that it knows it needs to be doing, I'm not sure. The first Trump administration was not enough for that. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was not fully enough for that. The combination of what we're seeing now is enough. A war in the Middle East, a war in Ukraine, and potential fallout with the kind of transatlantic security partner. Maybe, hopefully. But I think there is also a likelihood of inertia, shock, not doing anything.
Yes.
And falling and fragmenting into little pieces and parts that are all trying to seek bilateral deals with the United States, where some countries may also seek sort of to hedge fully, and a bunch of Switzerlands that they're trying to become in the end. And I think that will be probably the worst outcome of this. A lot of forces that are trying to prevent that.
Yes.
But they will be successful. Let's see. Maybe I'll be more optimistic tomorrow, so we should have another conversation.
Well, we do hope you'll come back anytime you want. But listen, this is a difficult question. But do you think America itself, the United States itself, has a part to play in the European Union, Europe being where it is today as far as security policy? And I'm thinking specifically to the common security and defense policy that Mr. Javier Solana, then in charge of security of the European Union, was encouraging. And I remember 29 or so, if I remember correctly, common security and defense policy deployments, the big one in the center of Africa. But those were highly discouraged by America, as I recall, saying, what do you guys think you're doing going off independently on your own? So my question is, does America itself have a role in not letting Europe develop the way it should have instead of supporting what was then taking place?
Yes, sure. But I think this is all something to do about sort of like who's the adult here? What is an adult relationship? What does a mature relationship between the US and Europe look like? And I do think that, if European allies had sort of matured enough to understand their own interest and to also convey them in a fashion that is more acceptable for the United States, then this situation would look differently. And the times have changed. The US has been encouraging a greater European defense role since, at least since the Obama administration. There had been no problem with greater engagement from the European side. There have been significant calls for greater defense spending, significant calls for burden sharing. It was clear that the burden had to shift towards the United States, towards the Europeans in that relationship, particularly with kind of mounting security concerns for the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think it is a bit of a strawman argument to say, well, you didn't let us and now you want us to. That's an adolescent response. I think we're in a very, very critical moment for European security. We're at a very, very critical moment of the transatlantic relationship. And we're at a very, very critical moment of the Europe-China relationship because of the support of the Chinese leadership for the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And this is something that has merged the two theaters that we're seeing. It's merged the theater, the Pacific theater, with the Atlantic theater in a way that puts the Europeans in a very uncomfortable position. And if this doesn't unleash the willingness to really take our own security into our own hands, then we could say, then we can't be helped, or maybe then we deserve the outcome that is there.
Yes.
I do think that is one of the main points here, that the reaction cannot be that, but if there's more support from China to Russia and the U.S. sanctions China, the Europeans will have to respond. That's a ludicrous response.
Yes.
Of course, any support that is going from North Korea or China to Russia right now is a direct threat to European security, and the Europeans should act on their own, for their own sake, and not wait for Washington, but actually take the lead. And we haven't seen that, and Washington wouldn't have blocked that in the last few years. So I think this is very much on the Europeans, and a big, sizable gang here in Europe knows that very well. But it is about galvanizing that political coalition that is needed to actually make this work.
One more question on this issue, and then I'll switch to some economic issues that I wanted to talk to you about. Do you think that Germany and France are still the engine that'll pull the security equation together for the Europeans, as you've just described?
It's a stuttering engine. It's an engine that isn't doing very well right now.
Right.
It's sort of maybe we're in that phase where from the internal combustion engine, we have to move to a battery-powered one. We look differently in the future. I do think there is a role for Poland to play, a new one. We're certainly seeing that there is a new role to play for Italy. This will definitely be a question of how the future relationship between the EU and the UK looks like after Brexit, now with the reset in the sort of UK leadership, but also with the changing security environment also for a UK perspective. So I think we have to rethink a little bit how dynamics evolve in Europe. And while as ECFR, my colleague Camille Grand has been writing about defending Europe with less America, I also we have to think about sort of withstanding Europe or kind of keeping Europe alive with less Germany.
Goodness. There are already 3 more programs that we need to invite you on to solve these issues. But listen, you brought up the economic, the automobile, the business, and Norway, admittedly a small country, but does not follow the American-led sanctions on Chinese cars, as Europe seems to be doing or wanting to do. And with the result that next year, if I remember correctly, they will meet their environmental automobile standards because of the electric vehicles coming in from Germany and the state of the art of the technology in Germany. So my question is, do you think if Mr. Trump does live up to what he wants to do, which is create a barrier between China and America as far as trade goes by huge tariffs and duties, do you think that the European Union countries will continue to follow America in higher and higher tariffs?
I think this has to be tackled from various angles and slightly differentiated. So there are issues and issue areas where Europe itself has a problem because of the kind of market distorting practices that the current approach of the Chinese government, the current economic approach is presenting to Europe. But I do think that we will see differentiated solutions from sector to sector. On the EV tariffs, I think this was a very intelligent move by the Commission to just slow down the problem and slow down the influx of cars, because we do not have the security regulation in place that is needed with regard to fully understanding the security impact of connected vehicles in our overall security structure. We do not have a mechanism in place that limits the amount of vehicles that can come into the market, and we do have a car industry that is significant and sizable, and that will have a problem in staying competitive if sort of the price differential remains as high as it is right now. I do think that we will see, as you've seen in the reports coming out of Brussels lately, a sector by sector understanding of saying, okay, how much risk can we tolerate? How large is what does the cost benefit analysis look like? So if you want to go through, for example, on solar panels, it probably doesn't make any sense at all for the Europeans to invest in domestic manufacturing, but it actually makes sense to import a lot from China, to diversify the supply chain where possible, but to sort of accept the risk that is there. Whereas in higher up the technology value chain technologies, when it comes to batteries, then there's probably going to be an intention by many European countries to reshore some of that production, even with the help of Chinese companies, as we're seeing now with Wuxi and others helping Northvolt actually coming into building the battery supply chain in Europe. On electric vehicles, I think this is because it has such a crucial intersection function in the economic system. This is very different. And the tariffs that the European Commission has now put into place, that have been enforced since the end of October, are also very nuanced. And they are designed to provide one thing that is kind of difficult for particularly Chinese state-owned enterprises, and that is a high degree of transparency about what the kind of economic background of these companies looks like. So the Commission has, instead of kind of doing a one-size-fits-all 100% tariff, there you go approach, it has started an intense investigation process, asked questions, had questionnaires filled out to figure out how large the perceived distortion through subsidies received per company is. And this is something that I think has a model character to just say, we will look at this case by case, industry by industry, and we will try to find as differentiated an approach as possible. But this approach does potentially run into problems because it can become an equivalent to a sort of a bureaucratic denial of service attack, right? You can have so many things that you're trying to control for at the same time that you are unable to then actually control. And so this will have to be a solution that can only be taken in sectors that are particularly critical. The next sector coming up, the next investigations coming up, is the wind sector, where the Europeans themselves have a huge interest in safeguarding their industrial base for the future of energy security. So I would not necessarily frame it as the Europeans following the United States on these issues, but the Europeans, and particularly Brussels, defining European interests in economic security, in competitiveness, in the question of national security, and in the question of decarbonization in their own interest. The decarbonization versus de-risking variable will be the trickiest one, because you mentioned it at the very beginning, sort of meeting the climate targets is very important. It's a law in Europe. It's a legal requirement to meet those climate targets. And there's going to be a really, really strong trade-off between reaching climate targets fast, reaching them at a low price, and sort of accepting a level of risk that comes in through relying on Chinese products in these sectors. And so this is something where democratic societies will have to find the kind of appropriate risk balance for themselves and redefine what that means for them.
Indeed. And let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris Live is entirely viewer-supported. We'd appreciate you signing up to our mailing list at kashmiri.com and to our YouTube channel, www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. I want to take a few minutes to ask you this question. In the West, the war between Russia and Ukraine is looked at as a clear war between authoritarianism and democracy. Yet the largest democracies in the world, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, do not support the sanctions. How do you account for this difference in opinion?
Well, I think it is absolutely understandable that the problems that are occurring in one part of the world are perceived quite differently in other parts of the world, and that other countries have relationships with Russia that go beyond and are their own thing. So I don't think that there's a general problem with the fact that India has a special relationship with Russia, has a historic relationship with Russia, has a historic relationship particularly in the defense sector, and has kind of created other reliances and dependencies that inform its own policy making. I don't think that there is a huge discussion in India about whether the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a violation of international law. This has been made very clear from the Indian government that they see it as such. So I don't think that just because you don't share the measures, it doesn't mean that you don't share the international legal principles that are underpinning this. I would also say that with the Trump administration coming into office in January, we will likely see less of a discussion of like system rivalry or authoritarianism versus democracy, But we will see more of a great power rivalry conversation. We will talk more about national rivalries and less about system rivalries. And I think there will be greater concerns on the European side about how deep the partnership also with the United States is going to look like in the future. But at the same time, even within Europe, we're having these conversations. Far-right and populist parties are on the rise in wide parts, even in the large countries, in France, also in Germany, in state elections quite successful. So I think we have to be very careful with the moral high ground that we like to take. Europeans can be quite hypocritical in that regard. And I think we have to be quite careful in how we look at these problems. The international legal underpinnings, however, have not changed. And the Russian aggression and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a violation of the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state. And therefore, the right to self-defense on the Ukrainian side is there. And I think sitting here in Berlin, you feel the direct impact of that on a daily basis. And I think this is something that is harder to feel when you are thousands and thousands of miles away.
Absolutely. And you so rightly point out that it's one of the basic understandings of the United Nations Charter, the violation of borders. So as we run into the tail end of our program, Janka, I want to ask you this question. China, America, European Union, these are kind of the engines in the front line of whatever is happening to change the situation in the world, the economy. And I want to ask you, if you had a few moments in private with President Xi Jinping and the incoming American president, Mr. Trump, what advice would you give each of them to improve the relationship between China and, let me just say, between China and America?
I think I'll be probably from both of their sides the worst person to give them advice. They probably don't want to hear from a European what they should do. So I probably refrain from providing concrete advice. I can only, though, say that how the relationship between China and the United States develops in the next 5 years is going to be decisive, not only for European prosperity, but also for European security. And I do think that there needs to be a level of understanding in both Beijing and in Washington about the gravity of the consequences of an even further deterioration of the relationship. I think putting a floor under the relationship has been something that the Biden administration has been trying to do. It is very much in Europe's interest that does take place and that is attempted further. But I do think that also Europeans have a role to play in this, and have a role to play also in signaling very, very clearly to Beijing that the support to Russia and the support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is something that deeply violates European security interests and thereby forever changes the relationship between Europe and China as well, without any sort of reference to the United States.
But would you then not make the same argument for the Indians and the Brazilians and the Malaysians? Russia's economy right now is stronger than it's been in a long, long time because Mr. Putin has converted it into a war economy. India is the largest buyer of Russian oil. It's supplying chips that are hard to get elsewhere. So wouldn't you make the same argument by telling the Indian government and others that, hey, listen, what you're doing will also impact your relationship with Europe?
I would say that the India relationship between Europe and India, the relationship has actually reached that level where these very explicit conversations are possible, and where there is an understanding that the Indian government is trying to seek solution to also de-risk its own relationship to Russia. There is a growing defense relationship between India and Western countries, including European countries. So I think those conversations are already taking place. Whether they always have to take place as public demonstrations of distrust, mistrust, and not liking the other's position, I think is a different story. I do think that these dialogues that are currently ongoing, with a lot of visits that are taking place, are making clear that the European security situation is dire, and that anything that can be done to alleviate that is appreciated very much. but that there's also a new world order emerging where other countries are going to play a much more significant role, and where it cannot just all be duked out between Europe, the US, and China.
Well, listen, we're running out of time, but I'm going to press you on one more issue before we let you go, and that is still in this room in private with Xi Jinping and Mr. Trump. If you were to think about one action, doable action, that you can tell each one of them, gee, why don't you do this? It'll reduce the tensions. What might that be? Would it be exchange of students? Would it be, just give me one.
So maybe I'm allowed to give you one that I would say to Mr. Xi if he was talking to European head of states and government. I would say limit the support to Russia today. Okay. You can decide today, you can do that today. It would be an enormous signal to the Europeans, and it would have an enormous impact. I am a bit at loss on what to advise the Trump administration, because I don't know yet what their goals are going to be. One advice I do think that is important is we have to maintain a level of civilized leader-to-leader conversations at all levels between European leaders and China, and between the US and China. I do think that these conversations are crucial for maintaining a kind of stability that is needed to avoid military escalation.
Well, Dr. Oertel, we've Lars run out of time. Thank you so very much for that timely and instructive conversation. I hope you'll come back and see us again. And so thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you also to our viewers from around the world. Join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the impact of the U.S. presidential election on the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China and the European Union, and its impact on all the other nations. Until then, goodbye.